Hi everyone, welcome to Interviewing and Putting Your Best Foot Forward. My name is Garrett Cleaver, HR Analyst in ODE HR. And today what I want you to get out of the next 30 minutes or so, what I want you to come away with are some concrete strategies and techniques you can use to better prepare for the interview process, which will ultimately reduce the stress and anxiety that comes with going through a job interview. That's our goal today. But before getting started and jumping in here, I want to get a quick pulse check on those in attendance. The goal today is how can we best prepare for the interview, especially when you're a candidate and you have limited information. How do you practice and prepare for something like that? And even how to reduce some of the stress as you're going through that process. Have you been through an interview process recently? As we're all state employees, we've probably been through this panel process where you walk into a room and you see that intimidating panel on the other side, and they're asking you questions and waiting for you to respond, and they're furiously writing notes. That is an intimidating process, but it doesn't need to be. But before we get into actual techniques, let's look at what actually happens in an interview. Let's take a look at an example, because practice and preparation is key, but we need to know what's going to happen. So in a typical interview process, right, you're looking at a panel member or a set of panel members. They're sitting across a conference room, and they ask you a question, something like, tell us about a time when you had to resolve conflict with a coworker. Pretty common question, conflict resolution. Tell us about a time when that happened. And maybe the candidate responds with something like this about how they treat their coworkers with respect and professionalism. This is a fine response, but it could probably be improved. So another poll on your screen. What do you think was the biggest issue with this response? Again, they responded, typically they get along with everyone and they don't have conflicts, but they treat others with respect and professionalism. No wrong answer here, just want your thoughts on how that can be improved or what might be an issue with their response. Okay, plenty of people feel they didn't give a specific example. That's definitely true. The question asked for, tell us about a time. And it was a brief answer. It might have taken them maybe 15, 20 seconds. And if they have been in the workplace, even if this is their first job, at some point they probably had to have a conflict with somebody, right? Now, it doesn't mean this has to be huge. It could just be a disagreement, but they really didn't answer the question and almost sidestepped it to an extent. What was actually happening here was an example of behavior-based interviewing. And in a behavior-based interview, which is very common in state government in the typical panel interview process, is all about asking about how you handled something. It asks you to describe training or experience, and it links a question to a competency. Basically, there's a reason they're asking the question. In that example of tell us about a time you had a conflict with a coworker, they want to know about conflict resolution. How has that candidate navigated that in the past? In the behavior-based interview, that panel is really trying to gauge your future behavior and performance, again, based on what you've experienced in the past. And you have a behavior-based question because you're going to get the format, tell me about a time when, or describe your experience if this happened, when this happened. They follow that typical format. How do you prepare for that? A great technique to do this is with the STAR format. And it stands for situation, task, action, and result. And the S in situation is about describing a situation you encountered that best targets or relates to that question. Again, in that example of conflict resolution, what have you experienced in the past that kind of speaks to that? You need to draw out a situation. So let's take a look at how that candidate might actually respond to that conflict resolution question back in the interview. And maybe they talk about, okay, we had a disagreement on a plan. They had an approach and simply had a disagreement with ideas on a coworker. They're setting the stage with the situation in their response. And again, it doesn't have to be incredibly complex. You're going to get a lot of questions in a panel interview, but you need to set the stage with that situation. The T in STAR is task. That's about describing the goal, what you needed or wanted to do. Almost like, why was this situation important? Why would you bring this up? Back to our interview, the candidate says, well, we had this disagreement, but we needed to get agreement. That was important because we had some timelines to meet. Okay, here's down to the heart of the conflict. It's a disagreement, but here's what the result might be if this person doesn't get it resolved. Now that they've set the stage with the situation, their task, what they needed to do, what was happening, they want to describe what they actually did. That's the action part of STAR. In the interview, after describing that situation and task, they might say, hey, here's my idea. I suggested we write down what we wanted in the plan. And you know what? I was going to involve another person. We were going to bring in another expert to take a look at our ideas. Again, that candidate's saying what they did. Here's the actions they took. Finally, they're going to describe the result, describe the outcomes from their actions that they took. And as a bonus, they might describe what they learned from the experience. And back to the interview, finally, they talk about the impact of their actions. They had brought this other person in, they got some new ideas, and hey, here was the result. We got that additional perspective. We got a great work product out of it and met our deadlines. Again, their goal, their task was to get this plan out and meet their deadlines. And the actions they took led to that result. Now, this was a positive outcome, and that's great. You probably want to, of course, describe positive results, positive outcomes, but easily this person might have maybe had an outcome that didn't go as planned, and that can be okay in a response to the question on that results piece. But it's important, if you do have an experience like that and you want to use that to demonstrate your knowledge and skills, that you also talk about what you learned from the results and even what you might do next time. Because ultimately what you're doing here is telling your story. What have you done, accomplished, performed, or learned? And then telling that story to that hiring manager, to that interview panel. Abraham Lincoln knew this. This is a quote from President Lincoln. President Lincoln was known as a master storyteller. He had in his back pocket a story for every situation, issue, incident. He could convey complex ideas, influence others, and leave a lasting impression through his stories. And President Lincoln was known for, again, having a story, an anecdote for almost any situation and conversation. So that's what I want to equip you all for. Be the Abraham Lincoln of the interview process. Be that master storyteller of your own skills and experiences. We know stories are important for learning, and they're going to leave an impact on that hiring manager and that interview panel. But in line with the essence of the theme of today's event, I want to give you some time and space to practice this with a pretty typical interview question about priorities. So take a moment on your own, either think about this or jot down an answer. I'll give you about 1 minute to describe a time when you could not accomplish everything you needed to do in a workday. How did you prioritize and what was the result? That technique is particular for that behavior-based interview question. Again, that Tell us about a time. Describe your experience. You might also encounter scenario or situation-based questions. And rather than asking about your past experience or education or knowledge, these types of questions are going to ask you how you would respond instead of what you did. And you know you have a situation-based question because the interviewer is going to ask, what would you do if? They might set some conditions. You have X, Y, and Z. What do you do? Or how would you approach the situation when something happens? You might also get follow-up questions. Let's say you had a great response, you use that STAR format, and the hiring manager comes back and says, well, what would you do if something else happened differently? They might switch it on you and give you a situation-based question. So you want to be prepared for that. But luckily, I believe that STAR format still helps you prepare for these. Essentially, what the interview panel has done is given you the situation. Now you just need to take the task, outline the goal, describe your actions, what you would do, but also still reflect on any past experiences. Is there anything that you can link to this situation that they're giving you? And what were the results? What outcome do you expect from these hypothetical actions? And what this interview panel is probably trying to do is just gauge your thought process. Let's throw out a situation that a person in this position might encounter. Maybe it's something unique, and how would they respond? Using that STAR format, you'll have some tools in your back pocket to respond to the hypothetical. And the way to start building that toolbox to demonstrate your skills and experience, and again, ultimately reduce interview stress, you want to start thinking like a hiring manager. So when you get that invitation to interview, think about, if I was the hiring manager, what would I want to look for in a candidate for this position? What would the successful candidate look like? Luckily, you probably already have some information about what that might be. Take a look at the job posting. In ODE jobs and many state jobs, there's that box or section at the bottom that talks about desired skills and attributes. Take a look at that list. Probably a good chance that the hiring manager is going to ask questions that target some of those skills and desired attributes. So take a look at that job posting and anticipate what that hiring manager is going to be looking for. Again, what does the successful candidate look like? And then finally, dig into your experiences, your education, your skills, your accomplishments, and prepare some examples using that STAR format. This isn't necessarily about anticipating particular interview questions because you don't know what exactly they might ask, but it's about targeting some of those things that might be successful for the job. What of your skills, experience, and education could help you be successful in that position? And can you tell that story, again, using that STAR format? Tell that hiring manager, tell that interview panel a story about your skills and experience that you believe will lead to success in the position. And this preparation is absolutely critical. Again, you want to come with that toolbox of your skills and experiences. So when you get done with that interview, you've left it all out on the table. You've fully described what you needed to, and now you've left it in the hands of that hiring manager. But that could all go out the window when you finally get in front of that intimidating panel and your mind goes blank. So what can you do when you're actually sitting in there to avoid that? The very first thing is simply breathe. When you receive a question, it's totally fine to take a couple seconds to breathe, think about your response, and again, pull that tool out of your toolbox to demonstrate your skills and experience based on that question. It's going to get oxygen to your brain, it's going to reduce your heart rate, and lower that stress and anxiety. And if you don't have the answer, let's say you've got a curveball question about skills and experiences or a situation that you've never encountered, maybe because this is a new position, promotion, you just haven't encountered that. Well, turn your answer into a scenario. At least be able to demonstrate your thought process, because you do come with a set of skills and experiences that are applicable. Otherwise, you wouldn't get that interview. So turn that into a scenario and outline your thought process for what you would do and what results you might expect for that situation you may not have encountered. And finally, keep in mind what you can actually control as part of this interview process. There are a lot of variables with the interview. You probably have very little control over the time and place, what questions will be asked, who the other candidates are, so no need to worry about who might have more experience or education than you. It doesn't matter, you can't control that. You can't control what happens next. That's going to be up to that hiring manager. And you can't control who's on that panel. What you do have control over is that practice, the preparation, and the research you've done into that job. And so by focusing on those areas, you can come in the interview better prepared, again, to reduce that stress and anxiety, all while keeping in mind that there are a lot of things you can't control, and that's okay. Focus on what you can. And as we close this out, just some additional tips as you navigate the interview process. The first is, don't assume the panel knows you. If this is an internal job, or if you're sitting across from panel members or a hiring manager you know, describe your experiences as if you don't know anyone on the panel. This can a lot of times trip up candidates. Maybe they feel like they would be boasting or wasting time of the interview panel, that hiring manager, if they talk about things they already know. But with that mindset, you might miss out on demonstrating and putting out there your skills and experience and education that you wouldn't have done if there were strangers on the panel. So describe your experiences as if you just met those people for the very first time. Also, be mindful of the time, how long your interview is. Do you want that story to be 5 minutes in response to a question, or 2 minutes? Gauge your time. A lot of times panels will put that time management on you. And research and ask your own questions. Very common way to start the interview process is, why do you want to work here? Why did you apply? Why did you want this job? So be able to talk about that. And very commonly, the hiring manager is going to close with, do you have any questions for us? And that's your opportunity to dig in there. And if you were mindful of your time, you can have a couple minutes to ask some thoughtful questions and turn the interview around a little bit, and also determine, is that position a good fit for you? And finally, there is no substitute for practice. So get somebody to ask some sample questions. Get a friend, a coworker, somebody you trust who can give you some feedback, and go in a conference room and say, here's some questions, ask me, I'll give you my responses and let me know what you think. You can also video yourself in a mock interview. See what your responses are, see maybe if you have any nervous tendencies, your tone of voice. Take that mock interview and get some feedback for yourself. And ODE HR is actually able to help with mock interviews and feedback, and you can contact us at ode.jobs@state.or.us if you want to go through a mock interview process, need help with interview questions and feedback. So definitely contact HR for additional resources. And again, I can't say enough that practice and preparation is key to reduce that stress and anxiety, so you come into that interview fully prepared to lay it all out on the table and really demonstrate your skills and experiences. So here's some homework, a couple homework assignments. Take some time, use that STAR format, the situation, task, action, results, to map out some of your accomplishments, experiences, education, and knowledge. Write out some things that you've done that you're proud of, and map out, okay, what did you do? What was your goal? And what were the results from your actions? Another great exercise is to make up your own interview questions. Again, think like that hiring manager and do that mock interview. Have that trusted friend, coworker, contact us in HR to ask you some questions and get some feedback. So that's your homework. Again, map out some of those accomplishments and experiences using that STAR format and do a mock interview. It could be as informal as just sitting across from a friend at a coffee shop, all the way to coming into work in a conference room, getting a couple people, and actually simulating that interview process. We covered the behavior-based interview and scenario-based interview questions and how to better prepare using that STAR format, and some ways to reduce stress and anxiety in the interview process. We didn't cover all that might happen in an interview, including assessments, assignments, things like group interviews, but I do believe if you use that STAR format to really outline your skills, education, and experience, it'll help you in any area of the interview process. I want to thank everybody for attending today. A couple additional resources. There is a handout in your control panel. It's from a federal agency, but it's a really good overview of the behavior-based question and the STAR format, and it's general, but again, a good overview. This presentation will be recorded and PowerPoint slides will be sent out to the attendees. And if you have any questions, my contact information is on the bottom of the slide. And again, you can contact ode.jobs@state.or.us for additional resources or even to set up one of those mock interviews and get some feedback. So I wish everyone the best of luck on their next interview and hope you knock it out of the park. Have a great day.